there's a lot of, say, criticism out there. Enterprises leaders that are looking to figure out how to achieve agility at scale are considering different options. They're looking at different perspectives, and some of what they see out there can be confusing, frightening. Some of it is fair criticism that is worthwhile addressing. As a member of both the professional Scrum community, the Agile community at large, as well as the SAFe community, I'm exposed to a lot of it, and I see my role as helping people both understand the criticism, understand what's real, what's not, as well as work to use SAFe in a way that makes sense, as well as work within the SAFe community as both a fellow and SPCT to actually deal with some of the fair criticism out there, either by explaining better or changing the ecosystem so that we actually reduce the likelihood of some of the anti-patterns that we see out. And with that in mind, this isn't a new topic. I was talking about not being afraid of the big bad wolf, even back in 2017 in a conference up in Maine in Agile Lake Day. If you want to see what I had to say there, you can check out the slides. I don't think there's a video recording available. But one of the topics that often come up is people are basing their criticism on the fact that they're seeing some bad SAFe implementations out there. They're seeing some anti-patterns, some mechanics, what I call SAFe theater, Agile in name only. A lot of the criticism that I hear is SAFe is implemented by people that don't understand enough about agility. To deconstruct the criticism, we need to understand more about who organizations are leveraging to implement SAFe. And that's where the SPC role comes in. SPC stands for SAFe Practice Consultant. And those are the people certified and positioned from perspective to lead the SAFe journey for an organization. If we look at the responsibility wheel from SAFe 6.0, we talk about responsibilities such as embodying a lean agile mindset, leading the change, implementing SAFe, and that includes coaching, training, coaching specifically around flow, and accelerating business agility. All of that makes total sense, right? You want to have somebody in your team as you're implementing any sort of scaled agile approach that would be helping with leading the change, training, coaching flow specifically. That there's nothing that doesn't make sense on this list. All of these things make total sense. Identifying that there's a need for this sort of role as part of an enterprise agile journey also makes total sense. In the past, if you look at the framework such as Scrum talks about the Scrum Master as a true leader. And when you dive deeper, you can see that the Scrum Master should really be in a position where they coach the organization, not just teams. And you can see them as some sort of parallel to the SAFe SPC role. Unlike Scrum, SAFe takes the approach of being very explicit that there are different roles at different levels of the organization. There's the Scrum Master team coach at the team level. There's the RTE, or what I like to call the art coach, or the art flow coach at the art level for a team of teams. That's very similar to the Scrum Master, but at a different scale. And you also have SPCs that don't necessarily have a role that is directly attached to a team or a team of teams. They work in between teams, they move between teams, arts, portfolios, and they support the overall journey. They're more at the level of the Lean Agile Center of Excellence, you might say. So with that in mind, what's wrong with this model? And in order to understand that, in order to start thinking about what's working well and what's not working well in this model, to dive into a SWOT analysis, if you'd like, for this model, the place I want to start with is with how you actually become an SPC. So if we look at how you actually become an SPC, you become an SPC. Formally, all you need in order to become an SPC is to participate in the implementing SAFe class. Join a class that's led by an SPC trainer. That 4-day class is great, going over both SAFe's principles, practices, mindset, as well as how to actually go about implementing it, the patterns for implementation, what to pay attention to. There's always room for improvement in what is included in that class, but there's also a limit to how much people can learn at the beginning. The issue is not with the class in my place. The issue is that after participating in the class and passing the exam, which is not trivial, but is still an exam, and that is a multiple choice exam about your knowledge from being in the class, people get certified to be an SPC. So far, so good. And if we look at what are some of the strengths of that model, the strengths that I see here is that people, when I've had leaders of implementations journey that I was involved with, when I was able to bring people like the VP engineering, like the PMO, like VP product, like some of the Agile coaches that are involved in the journey, attend an implementing safe class, and they come into the room, whether it is with Agile experience or not, to really understand the nitty-gritty details beyond what can be discussed in a 2-day leading safe class. People are equipped through the SPC certification to be effective leaders for their Agile journey. They really understand the principle, the patterns, what works, what doesn't work. They become great partners for driving the journey. And they can serve as SPC, the coaches within the organization. They can become champions. And the fact that we have these sort of people, that I have this VP engineering that participated in the SPC class, and after it said, you know what, I'm going to be the RTE for my organization. It was a small organization, one art. I'm going to be the RTE for that organization, at least in, the first couple of PIs. I want to be involved at that level. Even if they don't want to take on that role, even if they want to on another role, being an SPC really helps. The other strength that we see is if you take the right people with the right level of experience. So they've trained people before, they've coached people before, or they've done enough with SAFe over time that they can actually do this well. The SPC certification, together with that experience, is a great combination that can support the scaling spin-out model that SAFe relies upon to achieve agility at scale. What SAI is basically saying is to make the role-based training required across the organization practical and cost-effective. So one assumption here is we really want to achieve meaningful change throughout the organization. People need to be trained. They need to understand what SAFe is about, get a deep understanding, including ideally the certification that causes them to stress test their learning and digest it. All of that is good stuff. We've seen results, including by what happened when Scrum was rolled out, that this sort of training really helps organizations improve. That doesn't mean you should measure the success of your Agile journey through how many people have you certified. You shouldn't. But there's plenty of evidence that if you support people with the right sort of learning, you really help them change their behaviors and achieve different outcomes. But when you look at the enterprise scale organization, that's quite a big lift for organizations, especially if you need to depend on specialized trainers. The model that the SAI came up with is the trainer fan out model, basically saying those SPCs can teach others. On the surface, that's something great. And I've seen plenty of SPCs or plenty of people that combining the right experience about Agile, the right experience about SAFe, the right class presence, the right gravitas, can take all of that, combine it, and deliver great training. The problem with the model is that the model doesn't enforce all of these prerequisites. The model only says, listen, we're going to certify you. We're not going to test all of the other things. That's not a model that we can apply at scale. We can do that when we have between 300 and 400 professional Scrum trainers. All of these people go through a rigorous process of figuring out that they're awesome and can actually deliver effective professional training. SAI goes through that process when we talk about the SPCTs. Again, hundreds of people that, where this sort of validation process that's human-based can work. But when we talk about SPCs, that's not the model right now. One could argue there are different ideas for how to stress test and validate these things. And I hope that at some point there's some development on that front. But the assumption is that the market can self-correct. The assumption is that even though people have the certificate, the market leaders that are hiring these SPCs or enterprises that are sending their internal people to become an SPC have realistic expectations of what these people can actually do just based on the certificate. And we're not asking them to do unreasonable things. But the reality we see out there in the trenches, based on what I see in some organizations I visit, a lot of it, what I see when people come to take classes, whether it's the SPC class or other classes, is that there are different dynamics. It's very tempting for organizations to rely just upon the certificate. And it's very tempting to some consultants or other practitioners and professionals to level up using that certificate and then go and teach a class. We hear some comments like, I've been sent to this class by my organization. I don't know anything about Agile or SAFe, but I need to train and launch an art next week with no outside help. Good luck. And when you see these sort of people as an SPCT teaching the class, you're wondering, is it even professional to give people this certificate and let them teach? Are we doing the right thing here? We see some consultants taking this class and add another 3-letter acronym to the resume to make more money. That's fair on their behalf. The problem is that on the other side, are people giving too much credence to just the certificate? It seems like it's based on some of the results that we're seeing out there. The other piece is the model of PCs starting to train. It seems like people can take a 4-day class and then start teaching a topic that they have no experience in. Sometimes it's a topic that they didn't even sit in the class for. Now, it's true that SAFe, especially these days, we verifies with people. Do you know, ask people to validate, do you know this topic that you're enabling yourselves to teach? But how often do people say, no, it's enough to ask this? But there is a valid question here about, is it SAFe's role to validate, or is it, is it an open market where the market should actually self-regulate around this? It's an interesting question of what's going on. Some of the results are that people sit in on mediocre SAFe training when it's delivered by people without the right experience, with the right intentions, but without the right experience. Some of that leads to SAFe theater, to people just going through the motions, people that do things without really understanding them or believing in them. And of course, that would lead to fair SAFe criticism. People from the outside see stuff that's not working. Not necessarily what the framework is talking about, but how the framework is being deployed is part of the ecosystem. The argument that this is different than what we talk about in the framework is an unfair answer to this criticism, because how we deploy the framework is also a big part of it. Those are interesting conversations that we have all the time within this community. And it's similar in any environment. When you look at Scrum, a lot of the Scrum you see out there is not something that looks like professional Scrum. And one could argue, well, that's people who are implementing it fault. Some other people would say, you know what? Maybe the fault is with the Scrum guide, with the ecosystem around deploying Scrum. It's a complex environment of how do we actually create frameworks that are easy to deploy the right way. Now, the threats that are emerging because of this are things like SAFe implementations that are stalling, people giving up on SAFe, the SPC certificate is being devalued, SAFe training is being devalued, people lose trust in the value that they might get with an SPC, even if that SPC has experience. We're starting to see environments where having an SPC is not necessarily adding value to your name. And that's worrying. That's a shame. That all leads to people that are less interested in learning deeply about SPC certification. There are a lot of people, for example, that I look at in the professional Scrum community. I think those people could become great SPCs, and some of them do become great SPCs. The combination of deep professional Scrum knowledge and learning about SAFe does make them great help for organizations that are trying to achieve agility at scale. But some of these people would not touch SAFe with a stick right now because of some of these dynamics. So it's a complicated, complex challenge. But I want to talk about opportunities. Let's not be all negative here. And by the way, I'm happy to look at comments and answer questions along the way. I'll have a specific Q&A section once I finish with the opportunities. Let's actually look at some opportunities that we have. One hope I have, and something I really have some evidence on, because that's what's happening in organizations that I'm involved with, is enterprises that develop a more realistic expectation of what the SPC is about and what to expect, especially from newly minted SPCs. When I work with an organization, I highly recommend that people deeply involved with the journey join the implementing, look at the toolkits, participate, pair up and support, say training, build a roadmap of where and when does it make sense for them to actually be solo SPCs, if you want to call it that. Especially when it comes to training. Training is maybe easier than facilitating a value stream identification workshop. Whether it's an internal situation or people that take the implementing safe class and come out of that class and say, you know what? I'm really glad I learned all of this. I understand how big this is, how much knowledge is needed, what's the experience that is needed. There are things I should be doing as my getting started steps, and there are things that I should probably work on building some capability, some competence around before I go into. I hope that the people that are taking the implementing safe class start to develop this understanding that this is a journey. I hope that enterprises and the leaders driving change build some understanding of what to look for when it comes to proficient, experienced SPCs that can really support our journey and go beyond just the SPC certification. There could be several ideas for how to do that. One tip would be to look at the article. If you're hiring an SPC, go look at the SPC article on Scaled Agile Framework with the responsibility wheel and all of the responsibilities. There are specific questions in this article. Ask people to share stories about their experience doing these things, some of the outcomes, some of the challenges that they faced. Tell me about a situation where you coached flow and conversations about limiting. Tell me a situation where you trained people on safe, whether it was a formal training or not. Tell me about those situations, not just did you take the SPC and did you pass. Another thing that I do when I need some help implementing safe or coaching an organization is I look for other indications. For me, the first person I go to is somebody that has both an SPC as well as something like a professional Scrum trainer that is going through some more validation in the journey. It also brings the value of another perspective. I appreciate people that actually have a diversity of perspectives and doesn't just look at safe. Even, a PSM3 is an interesting combination because it's an open exam that shows a lot of experience. Also just examples. There could be other things, and it's not just about certifications, but if you're a certificate looking person, maybe look at the other certifications as well. Another opportunity to do something about this is for SPCs as well as Lean Agile Centers of Excellence and enterprises looking at this, SPC communities of practice, to look at this responsibility wheel as some sort of competency or improvement, self-assessment, and identify potential areas for them to focus on. There's an interesting comparable tool that Scrum.org created recently. Stephanie Ockerman paired up with Comparative Agility and Scrum.org, which is the Scrum Master Improvement Self-Assessment. Something similar could be very useful for SPCs. And some of my colleagues in the SAFE community are also helping SPCs that want to grow with the SPCs Unleashed series. There's a lot of content that we could provide, a lot of additional learning that SAFE already provide for SPCs, but it starts with people wanting to actually go through this journey. The whole problem that I'm talking about is not the SPCs that are at a certain place in their journey and understand where they're placed and want to improve. Those people are great. They're great partners for. My challenge is with people that are just abusing this model and with organizations that are putting people into untenable situations where they are asked to do some things that are unrealistic because of some economic incentives or other incentives as part of how people are structuring the implementation. That's something we should discourage. We should find ways to discourage organizations from making these expectations from fresh SPCs. I see my role as an SPCT and as a say, fellow is to actually talk about this. And that's why I'm doing this live stream. Talk to enterprises, continue to educate people about how to look at the SPC role, what should the SPC journey look like, how to structure a safe journey, what's the role of partners and external SPCs and SPCTs and fellows, what's the role of internal SPCs, how it's a partnership between them, how over time you should build an internal, dependable team of SPCs that can take on everything and not necessarily need an external SPC or SPCT forever, but it doesn't mean that you can start like that from day one. Another idea that has been circulating is to come up with some sort of professional SPC credo manifesto where we talk about the fact that SPCs as part of this community agree to, what does professionalism look like? When are we ready to train people? When are we ready to actually go and do something and to agree not to do something that is unprofessional on the border of unethical as SPCs? Some of that would make more sense when it comes as part of the framework. And I know there's great work being done to help clarify these things by SAI. So stay tuned for that. But I think part of it is also our role as the community of professionals in this space, whether it's SPCTs that a lot of SPCs listen to, whether it's in the SPC class or later on, whether it's say fellows and whether it's, say SPCs. We should also be listening to feedback and criticism about the SPC role and engage in these conversations. I tell people I'm always happy to discuss any sort of say criticism as long as it's a constructive, respectful conversation. So feel free to pull me into any such conversation. So to sum up, today we talked about the SPC role and some of the strengths and promises of that role in supporting the agility journey for organizations. We talked about some of the weaknesses that are a result of this model, especially the limited validation of the experience needed to get the SPC certification in parallel with the fact that organizations are treating the certificate itself with too much value, not looking at the whole picture of what the SPC brings. We talked about some of the impact of that issue and some ideas for how to address this that we could all do something about, whether it's us as SPCs, us as SPCTs or fellows, or us as people thinking about how to actually weave together internal, newly minted SPCs with people with the right experience, whether they're coming from inside the organization or from outside. Hope this was useful. Happy to continue the conversation in the comments or on LinkedIn or YouTube. If you are looking for help to figure out how to actually build an SPT model that works for your organization, feel free to reach out.